Well, the fires in California are still raging as I record this. Fueled by dry conditions, fanned by the annual Santa Ana winds, the fires in the Los Angeles basin and the surrounding communities have been some of the worst in that state's long history of fires. More and more, we're learning that while heroes do all that they can, that they've been hamstrung by reckless, feckless decisions by so-called leaders. I heard a report the other night from California. The reporter on the street talked about the crews who have been slaving against the odds, with some of them going for 72 hours without stopping. I mean, can you imagine? 3 days without a break as they work and slave and haul hose lines and rescue trapped residents. 72 straight hours, and yet the fires at that point were still at zero containment, and to this day they really still are, many of them. More fires springing up all the time. But those are heroes, by God. I mean, during my time in Army Ranger School, I went for days on end without sleep, and it becomes not just a matter of physical endurance, but a test of the will and a determination of the mind. You can actually get to the point that lack of sleep creates an inability to make clear decisions. I can distinctly recall hallucinating from going 3 days or more without rest or sleep, and these firefighters in California, they are on it, man. They are still in the fight. They are heroes. So think about it. What exactly is a hero? We're going to dive into that for a minute before I get into those leadership decisions I told you about. What exactly is a hero? I mean, it's not a rhetorical question. I suspect that when most people get asked that question, they have two reactions. One is they picture the word definition of a hero, like how's it defined in the dictionary? But then I would dare say that most folks also kind of conjure up an image in their mind of what they see in their mind's eye as a hero. The image of a person or a character, whether real or fictional, that sort of creates the image of hero by way of that mental picture. Okay, so yeah. Hero by definition means a person who is admired or idealized for courage, for outstanding achievements or noble qualities, and often there's someone who rises to an occasion. The right words, the right actions at the right time for the right reasons in such a way that makes a difference in the lives of others. Oftentimes those words or actions are committed in some selfless manner, with the hero feeling the possibility of backlash or dishonor or even death if necessary to stand up for what's right to do. All right, so that's a textbook description. But what about the imagery? I mean, what do you picture when I say, what's a hero look like? I mean, is there a mental image of a hero that sticks with you? And if so, is it somebody like straight out of Central Casting? I mean, you know what I mean. Tall, handsome, debonair, good hair, sharp as a tack, smooth with words, can't take him in a fight. For real. That imagery would be understandable, but if you get right down to it, heroes often seem to defy stereotypes. I mean, to be sure, there are those who look like recruiting posters, right? Like Pat Tillman. He was a former NFL football star. Had just a rock-solid jaw, huge muscles, became an Army Ranger. Ronald Reagan, he was a dashing cowboy movie star who became a president. But I've also seen just the opposite, and I'm sure you have too. I remember one big old dude in Iraq who looked like the epitome of someone who'd be dangerous, but he was the first one to hide behind people in a firefight. And he didn't stay on that team much longer either, just saying. Years ago, when I was a young lieutenant in training at Fort Benning, I had a good friend. He was a good friend for only a matter of months, really, as we went through the infantry officer basic course together. But the guy left a lifelong impression on me. His name was Bosco Masukwa, and he was an officer from Malawi, Africa. He wasn't more than like 5'5" or something, with a face that always looked like he was smiling even when he wasn't. He looked like a good wind might blow him down, but I saw that guy do more than most guys who were twice his size. Once on a ruck march, as we were going like for 20 miles through the night, I realized he was carrying the team gear almost entirely by himself. There were 3 other guys who had been dropping things in his rucksack and telling him to carry it, and he took it without complaint. I mean, they just kept dumping stuff on him, and instead of complaining, he took it and he carried the equivalent of his body weight for miles until I saw what was happening and made it stop. The dude was a rock. He never quit, but if you looked at him, you wouldn't expect that. I also remember this scrappy little kid who I've known since he was just a nubbin, like this tall, 90 pounds soaking wet in high school, it seemed like. Not the top of his class in high school, but he didn't go off to an Ivy League school either. And yet now he's a chief in the Navy SEALs with 20 years of service and multiple combat tours. You see, I believe that heroes are really just ordinary Joes and Janes who stood up when they were needed. They come in all shapes and sizes, every race and creed. They're not defined by any educational status. They're often considered the least among them, really. But they generally always have a grit and a character and a heart that sets them apart. I mean, if you look at Scripture, you're going to find over and over again that God's notorious for choosing the least among to serve as his heroes, right? I mean, David's family, when Samuel was anointing the king, he went to David's family. They didn't even think David would be worthy of bringing out for Samuel to meet. So they left him out in the fields. They had to send for him. Turns out he was God's chosen. He later slayed the giant Goliath. He was mighty in battle. He was King David. How about Gideon? He was hiding in a wine press to avoid the enemy before he was called to leadership. Esther, she was a Jewish woman with no real voice in the king's court until she was told to speak, quote, for such a time as this. And she did so at the risk of her own life. I mean, even Jesus, if you get down to it, was a surprise to those who were really looking for the Messiah. What good thing can come from Nazareth, they would say. Well, I mean, even if you don't believe he was who he said he was, the fact remains his very existence, which is documented even outside the Bible, changed the entire world. But go back to the heroes of today in California, because right now there are whole swaths of California that are burning. I mean, go online and look at the videos of people that are staring out their windows as walls of raging fire consume their yards and move in on their houses. This is a big one, y'all. And the heroes are in the mix. The heroes are there every single day, and we should not take them for granted. This is a disaster of epic proportions. And the crazy thing is, the fires are not just like out there somewhere, right? They're not in the wilderness area. This is not a remote region of the Big Sur or state park somewhere. This is in places like Pasadena, Pacific Palisades, Altadena, Malibu. All around Los Angeles, offshore winds are driving these massive fires. City blocks and restaurants and businesses and homes and whole neighborhoods. In Pacific Palisades, where movie stars and real estate moguls live, tens of thousands of people were ordered to evacuate. After nearly a week of massive blazes, some of the fires still have zero containment. More than 10,000 homes and structures have been destroyed. Thousands more threatened. Throughout the greater Los Angeles area, over 1.5 million homes and businesses were without power for a while. For the first time in 20 years, the LA Fire Department had to call in off-duty firefighters, and the state of Arizona is sending additional fire management teams to assist. We're even seeing planes flying in to help with the water drops from Canada and other neighboring states, and even Mexico providing people. Roadways are jammed with abandoned vehicles as people try to flee the area and crowd the roads, making them impassable for evacuations and for first responders to get through. A second wildfire broke out near Altadena, north of LA. Over 1,000 acres burned there. A third fire zone kicked up near the Sylmar neighborhood of LA and quickly consumed hundreds of acres. Look, why am I telling you all this? First of all, because it's a human tragedy. Those are our people. I mean, make no mistake, I'm a conservative. I loathe California politics, but I love California. I actually lived there for several years. It's truly the Golden State. Its beauty is amazing, its resources, its history, and it is on fire as we speak. But I tell you all this also for a second reason, and that is that this whole fiasco was largely preventable. I mean, you heard me. Wildfires in California are made worse because of liberal policies that make it impossible to mitigate the damage. I mean, make no mistake, fires happen, I get that. And they're going to happen again, and they'll happen again. They always have. But when you know how to prevent them, or at the very least how to mitigate them, or how to slow them down, how to even put them out, and you're not allowed to do that because environmentalist whack jobs have control of your politics, well, that's the height of absurdity. That's the epitome of cutting off your nose to spite your face. But we saved the air, we saved the trees, we saved the spotted owl, we conserved resources. Yeah, you burned everything down in the process. So any of you who have been in the military, you know what happens when a training range comes into contact with an endangered species, right? I mean, God forbid that troops walking through the woods at Fort Bragg or Fort Benning, Fort Liberty and Fort Moore, might disturb a red-cockaded woodpecker. I mean, you see a red-cockaded woodpecker, training shuts down and the training lands are closed off for good. I've seen it happen time and time again. Safety briefings are given to troops before they conduct their unit movements or land navigation exercises to ensure that if they see a special woodpecker, or the snail darter is known to be in the area, or a special tortoise, that they will report it and training comes to an end. The same U.S. Army that can defeat its enemies on the battlefield and wreak destruction on bad guys can be taken down by a bird or a turtle or a fish. It's true. Ask any soldier. But it is that mindset that is making the tragedy in California so much more tragic. In Pacific Palisades, a beautiful star-studded $1 million community, the firefighters had to stand and watch in frustration as things burned all around them because there was no water in the fire hydrants. The pressure from the local reservoir was too low. In fact, one of the major reservoirs was empty, and the water needed to extinguish the flames was not there. Rick Caruso, a guy who actually ran for mayor, he said that reservoirs had not been refilled in a timely manner. Local conservation efforts and liberal leadership had left the reservoir levels dangerously low, and the hydrants have all been running dry. Now, I'm just saying, that's a recipe for disaster, and we're watching the disaster unfold. But the other issue driving the train is the fact that land management is stymied by red tape and environmental bureaucracy. To effectively manage land and mitigate potential for fire damage, it requires going through and purging the grounds of loose and dry fuel. You cut away dead brush, you remove dried down trees. You make it less likely that a future fire would have enough dry fuel. It doesn't mean you deforest an area, not at all. It means you clean it up so that it burns less. But the process of obtaining permission to clear dense lands of fire fuel, it can take years just to get permission from the red tape environmentalists. They conduct their studies. They look for endangered species. They fret. They wring their hands. They talk about saving whales. Here's a classic example. In 2021, 10,000 acres of northern spotted owl habitat went up in smoke in Northern California. Okay. The northern spotted owl, an endangered species. Well, the Forest Service was well aware that the area was at risk of a wildfire, and they had a plan to protect it. Okay, endangered species, 10,000 acres, we want to save the owl, so we got to do some things to make sure it doesn't burn down. But the project was tied up for like a decade, by environmental reviews and objections from environmental activists who ironically were concerned about the owls themselves, concerned about the owls' well-being. Well, they dithered and they fretted and they talked about saving the earth, and the owls burned. Those sorts of years-long delays are becoming all too common. My personal time in sunny California was spent mostly in the community of Laguna Niguel, not too far from LA, a beautiful hillside area with rolling canyons that reach all the way down to the coast. My backyard looked out over one of those canyons. It was gorgeous. And in 2022, 20 homes in my old neighborhood burned to the ground as a small brush fire was not able to be contained. Dry ground cover fed the fire, and people's lives were devastated as a result. But you add to that situation two other matters that are so easily preventable. In 2018, then President Donald Trump called out California conservation laws which divert water resources to the ocean. Environmentalists had convinced politicians and bureaucrats in the Golden State that fish and wildlife were threatened by allowing the diversion of water for the irrigation of farms. As such, a mitigation of the amounts of water available to fill reservoirs and provide water to farms and, yes, to firefighting has been a raging debate in California for several years. Well, in one of his mean tweets that makes liberal heads explode, Trump said back then, quote, "California wildfires are being magnified and made so much worse by bad environmental laws which aren't allowing massive amounts of readily available water to be properly utilized." It was quickly denied. That can't be. He doesn't know what he's talking about. What's he saying? He doesn't know anything about land management. Well, the issue was chalked up to him being a climate change denier and all of it. He didn't understand the science. Guess what? He was absolutely right. And now the lack of water resources for things that are necessary, is causing the fires in California to rage out of control. But then we get to one of the last major issues that leaders in California have not gotten their hands around. The system that had actually sparked so many of these fires is a system owned by Pacific Gas and Electric, the major supplier of electricity to Californians. Cited again and again for its aging infrastructure, PG&E, they call for rate increases on a regular basis, and yet their system is still rife with problems. Problems that have time and again caused the fires that destroyed property and took lives. They're being sued right now for a number of fires over recent years. An independent investigation found that PG&E has successfully pressured state regulators over the years to approve their rate hikes while not adequately maintaining what one report called aging and rickety equipment. In 2018, and I'm a lawyer and I didn't know you could do this, but in 2018, PG&E, the company, pleaded guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter in what was known as the Camp Fire. That Camp Fire that burned 154,000 acres, destroyed 18,000 structures, and killed 84 people. And yes, the company pled guilty to 84 counts of manslaughter. It is one of the many fires attributed to PG&E, including a fire in May of 2019, which was sparked by a faulty transmission line from a tower that was 99 years old. So you look at all this. These are leadership issues. Yes, fires will happen. Yes, they will continue to happen. But no, we are not just supposed to take it and assume that nothing can be done. Leadership has to say enough is enough and stop jeopardizing life, limb, and property to save a snail darter or protect a monopoly power company that doesn't want to do what's needed to mitigate danger. But too often those heroes that I spoke of earlier, they are held hostage by the whims and dictates of leaders that are either reckless or feckless. And that's where I'm going now. Because I talked about the heroes. I talked about some of the examples of things that are happening. But generally speaking, with the exception of Jesus, every hero needs support. Every person willing to go into the fray, to go to hard places to do hard things, still needs support and backup and supplies and logistics. They need a team. They need to know that someone will have their back. So I'm saying all this because right now, what we're watching as this plays out in California is the fact that heroes, those who were expected and unexpected, are standing in the gap in real time, and they need support. They need leaders who will say, what do you need? How can I back you up? But in too many ways, we're also watching what happens when a leader is reckless or a leader is feckless. Reckless leadership, feckless leadership, one of those makes decisions without regard for the outcome. The other one can't make decisions because of the fear of the outcome. And the apocalyptic scenes that we're seeing right now in California, they're giving us ample evidence of both. So let me break them down for you for a minute. Reckless. Reckless leadership puts agendas over people. Reckless leadership grabs hold of resources that are designed for other things and uses them as tools for their own desires, as opposed to being something for the greater good. Reckless leadership looks at norms and sees them as being trivial or inconsequential, even frivolous, and is willing to take something that's meant for one thing and use it for another thing in order to get what they want for their personal agenda. A classic example of reckless leadership is Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass. Mayor Bass, she knew that firemen fight fires. Of course she did. She knew that safety and good order are one of the primary functions of government. But her reckless leadership thought it was better to use the city of Los Angeles' amazing fire department as a social experiment. So she cut fire department's budget most recently by over $17 million and redesignated many of those funds to the homeless. Mayor Bass recklessly invoked the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion as being one of the top priorities for the LA Fire Department. One of the top priorities, not fighting fires, diversity. DEI and the hiring of personnel and staffing of the support elements. And Mayor Bass proudly announced another glass ceiling was broken when she tapped the first LGBTQ woman to lead the fire department. Because everyone knows that when your house is burning down and your life's at risk, that you absolutely need to know what gender, skin color, or sexual orientation your rescuer has. Well, then add to it all that the reservoirs that feed those fire hydrants, like I talked about earlier, they were not topped off because Mayor Bass hadn't ordered their levels checked and refilled prior to a fire season that comes every year. As a result, firefighters, like I said, they arrived at their blazes only to find their hydrants were dry. You can't put out fires if you can't put the wet stuff on the hot stuff. And everybody knows that. But the leader was not being a leader. The leader was being reckless. You got to also reach back and look at the COVID time frame and the depleted ranks of the LA Fire Department made worse by how many were let go in the wake of their COVID protocols and vaccine mandates. And then you look, inexplicably, at all of the surplus firefighting equipment that was sent to Ukraine, which is now not available to backfill the needs of the department. All of this, despite the fact that Mayor Bass has seen a long history of wind-driven fires every year, because this is a thing. This doesn't happen once in 100 years. This is a thing that happens almost every year. She's got history to draw from. But she set all of that aside and recklessly made decisions that are now fueling the damage caused by massive, out-of-control fires sweeping through her city of Los Angeles. I saw one headline this morning that said the city of Angels is becoming a living hell. Reckless leadership gets people killed by having a blatant disregard for the risks of the actions that it takes. But equally bad is feckless leadership. Feckless leadership is leadership that looks silly and nervous when what is needed is confidence. Feckless leadership cracks jokes at the wrong time and waffles on decision making and gets mad when someone doesn't agree. Joe Biden and Gavin Newsom, they share the prize for that one. Their apologists, their spin doctors will tell you that everything those two do is on the winning side of every argument. But the whole world can see what's happening and just shakes their heads in disbelief as the feckless leaders waffle and waver. Gavin Newsom caved to environmentalists and set up Southern California for failure by diverting water resources unnecessarily. He refused to effectively implement state land management plans to clear dry undergrowth and debris, just feeding the fires. But now he's blaming others because that's what feckless people do. Among all the many instances of Joe Biden's fecklessness, and there are many, perhaps some of the most galling examples came in the past few days as he first went to New Orleans to attend a memorial for the fallen in the terror incident of New Year's Eve. And he doddered around, and he fell asleep during the ceremony, literally fell asleep in the ceremony. And then out to California, where he listened to the reports of destruction after Air Force One shut down the airspace for over an hour. After hearing the reports of the death and destruction, and seeing the faces, and looking lost as a coot while he did it, Joe turned to the press and said, "But hey, I became a great-grandfather today, ha." What? People are dying and losing everything, and billions will have to be spent to rebuild it. But the president is so uncomfortable with the gravity of the moment that he felt the need to lighten the mood by making it about him and his family. That, my friends, is feckless. Feckless leadership gets people killed. It destroys morale because of a lack of command presence. Reckless leaders get people killed. Feckless leaders cause more loss from waffling and wavering. But heroes, they do come in all sizes. They're really more often than not just normal folks. Normal folks who do abnormal things. Things that may surprise even themselves. Don't count out the little guy, right? We need heroes. We need them every day. We need them for such a time as this. Because right now, what we're watching is that reckless and feckless leaders, well, they just wind up being respectless, if you catch my meaning. Reckless and feckless leaders are fiddling while California burns. But the little guy, the salt of the earth hero who says, "Not on my watch," yeah, bring them more. Bring more of them, Lord, we need them. Because the Golden State's on fire. So let's pray for our friends in California and hope that something good can come from this in the end. That's my philosophy.